Imagine America in 1943, massive cities, the roar of traffic, streets crowded with people, and at the same time, food shortages. On the surface, it seemed the industry was running at full capacity, farms were producing, yet stores remained empty. But during this time, millions of ordinary families found a way to grow nearly half of the nation's vegetables right in their own homes. Not on large farms, not with expensive fertilizers, and not with industrial seeds, but on small plots, in empty yards, on rooftops, near schools and parks. People recalled it as something almost magical. Seeds turned into garden beds into harvests, and harvests into the confidence that there would be food tomorrow. And the most remarkable part, no one was telling them, "You must do this." They were simply shown how to work with the land in a way that made it produce more than it seemed capable of. Newspapers printed instructions, the radio told stories, and governments quietly and almost imperceptibly supported the initiative. Here's the interesting part. These methods, which allowed ordinary families to grow more food with fewer resources, were later carefully hidden. Large chemical and seed corporations understood. If people learned to manage the land on their own, they wouldn't need expensive fertilizers, patented seeds, or industrial solutions. Millions of Americans could survive and feed themselves without the industry that earned billions. That is why this knowledge nearly vanished from the public sphere, even though the land, the soil, and the microorganisms that these families worked with remembered everything. Contemporaries recalled that the techniques were simple and yet almost brilliant. For example, families would leave plant remains directly on the garden beds instead of taking them to compost or trash. It seemed trivial, but it had an incredible effect. The soil retained moisture, fertility increased, and microorganisms were literally revived. Microorganisms that could not later be bought in a store. Researchers who studied old garden beds many years later discovered unique communities of fungi and bacteria that could restore the land in just a few years, even after decades of depletion. People back then didn't know complicated terms like mycorrhiza or soil biology. They simply followed the home gardening guides. One eyewitness recalled that his grandmother never removed leaves or branches from the garden. "The soil will take care of it itself," she would say. And indeed, in a couple of years, the plot produced a harvest that amazed the neighbors. Carrots, cabbage, greens, all grew stronger and tastier than on neighboring plots where the soil was cleaned. Another element of these secret practices was even more unusual. If the soil seemed dead, gray, compacted, lifeless, families would take a few handfuls of earth from the nearby forest. They carefully mixed it with garden soil, and over the years, plants appeared that grew strong and healthy while the soil literally came back to life. Scientists later wrote that even a thin layer of such forest soil could restore microorganisms lost over decades and return the land's ability to self-develop. People at the time simply called it garden magic. These methods allowed them to grow more vegetables, use less water, and almost never need fertilizers, which were scarce at the time, but later described as essential. Another equally important effect, participating in these practices gave people a sense of control over their own lives. Urban families who had never owned land suddenly became gardeners, watching seeds sprout, harvests grow, and jars filled with vegetables and fruits. It wasn't just about feeding the family. It created a sense of independence, confidence, and stability. Stories of how this worked were passed from family to family. People would say that in a year, you could grow more than seemed possible if you understood the soil and worked with it correctly. Some families noticed that leaving plant remains on the soil, mixed with forest soil, literally produced a super harvest, cabbage and carrots that grew faster and larger than their neighbors. And this simplicity, available to everyone, became a serious threat to big corporations. When the war ended and government attention gradually shifted, the knowledge began to disappear. The fertilizer and seed industries found a new goal. People must buy products, seeds, and chemical supplements again. Those who could grow their own food were gradually forgotten, and garden beds were replaced with lawns and ornamental plants. But the soil remembered everything, and traces of these practices survived in families that never stopped using the old methods. That is why today, as we study these approaches again, we realize this is not just history. It is real survival science, tested by millions of American families. Not laboratory theory, but practical knowledge that could restore the soil, grow more food with fewer resources, and create confidence in tomorrow. Even after nearly a century, there are ways to bring life to any plot of land, simply by using methods that were nearly forgotten because big industries wanted us to forget them. Seeds, soil, plant residues, simple things, yet they were what created harvests and preserved the land's vitality. It is said that if you look closely at old guides and family records from that time, you can identify 6 practices that worked particularly well. They restored soil, retained moisture, produced higher yields, and required almost no fertilizer. And this is not a myth. Modern science studying old gardens confirms that these methods really work. If you look closer, you can understand why big industries wanted these methods forgotten. They show that humans can manage the land without chemicals, patents, or large corporations. This knowledge almost disappeared, but it still lives in the soil, old garden beds, and the stories of families who remembered it. And this is where our story begins, a dive into the secrets of that time, hidden for nearly 80 years. First, we will explore the practices that restored soil and produced incredible harvests from virtually nothing. The stories of the people who did this back then seem to whisper, you can do the same. So, if you thought that the secrets of the soil ended with leaving leaves and branches on garden beds and adding forest soil, you are deeply mistaken. The story continues, and it is even more fascinating. There are 4 practices left which, according to the memories of those years and modern research, could truly turn an ordinary garden into a miniature farm, producing yields that modern gardeners can only dream of. The first of these, recounted by the elders of small towns, was related to the remarkable partnership of plants. Different crops were planted together in ways that helped each other grow. Corn, beans, and squash, seemingly simple vegetables, but together they created a fully self-sustaining ecosystem. Corn grew tall and provided support for the beans. Beans added nitrogen to the soil, and squash grew broad leaves that shaded the ground from overheating and weeds. Families who planted vegetables this way were said to get more food with less effort while keeping the soil healthy. Researchers later confirmed this combination of plants indeed improved soil structure, increased yields, and naturally protected against pests. The next practice was no less astonishing, a compost potion, or compost tea. At that time, people didn't just pile up waste, they knew how to turn it into a living liquid that literally revitalized plants. A bucket of water, a handful of mature compost, and within a day it became a concentrate of microorganisms that protected plants, accelerated growth, and strengthened roots. Elders recounted that even the most finicky vegetables suddenly became strong, green, and flavorful. It is said that this liquid could replace dozens of dollars worth of fertilizers that later became a standard necessity in stores. Yet another practice amazed with its simplicity and effectiveness. People worked with the soil by always keeping it covered with plants, even in winter. They planted clover, rye, or other crops that were not meant for food, but simply protected the soil and fed it with nitrogen. It was said that soil cultivated in this way could retain moisture several times better and produce crops even in dry years. Imagine ordinary yards and empty plots turning into small natural laboratories where each plant performed a specific task. Finally, the last practice, almost forgotten by people, seed saving. Seeds were taken only from the strongest, most resilient plants and carefully stored, passed from family to family. It was said that this way, plants adapted to the specific soil, climate, and even the micro conditions of the yard. Each generation of seeds became stronger, more productive, and more resistant to diseases. Modern research confirms this is not a legend. Adapted seeds truly create a genetic memory that enhances plant resilience and yields. These 4 practices, together with what we discussed earlier, created a fully autonomous system for growing food, almost without spending on fertilizers or water, while the soil became increasingly fertile. And this is exactly why big companies tried so hard to erase them. If everyone could restore the soil and grow their own food, there would be no need for expensive fertilizers, patented seeds, and chemicals. Today, as we study these methods, we can understand why millions of families were able to grow half the country's vegetables in their small plots. Not with advanced technology, not with industry, but simply through an understanding of soil, plants, and nature. And importantly, this knowledge still works. Even today, by applying these principles, one can achieve massive yields, restore the soil, and create a healthy ecosystem without spending thousands of dollars. The stories of people from that time teach us. The soil remembers everything we do with it. And if we stop destroying it and start working with it as our grandmothers and grandfathers did, it can return incredible results. By leaving plant residues, adding living soil, combining crops, using compost teas, green cover crops, and their own adapted seeds, families of the past created productive systems that still amaze scientists today. And here's what is particularly important. This knowledge is not sold, cannot be patented, and is fully accessible to anyone. The soil remembers, the plants remember, and when we return to these methods, we regain control over our harvest, over the quality of our food, and over life on our plots. These 4 practices are not just old tips. They are real fertility magic, tested by millions of families throughout America's history. That is why, if you want your garden to produce maximum yield, for the soil to come alive and give more every year, it is worth paying attention to these methods. This is not theory. It is proven practice, nearly forgotten due to corporate interests, but still incredibly effective. History teaches us. Nature can work for us if we give it a chance. And now that chance is ours again, we just need to remember how our ancestors did it.